if you didn't read the newsletter, you don't know that 2024 is the mother of all election years. Some people are calling it the Super Bowl of election years.
And 2024 is expected to be the largest expression of democracy in human history, with more than half of the world's population living in countries that will host nationwide elections next year. But in many of the largest and most important elections, including in the United States, it is democracy itself that will be on the ballot.
There are, depending on who you ask, there are different counts, but the highest count that I found is from the Atlantic Council, and that's 83 elections happening in 2024. Over 50 of those are national elections, so presidential, prime minister, that kind of thing, occurring in 78 different countries. That includes a lot of heavy hitters. Altogether, this means that more people are going to be voting this year than any other year in history. So billions of people are going to be flocking to the polls. Hopefully, I mean, maybe they'll all be sitting at home not going to the polls, but we're going to assume that they're going to be going to the polls. So that includes 7 of the world's 10 most populous countries: India, the US, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, Mexico. A keen observer might think to yourself, well, some of those quote unquote elections that are happening are not exactly happening in free and fair and functioning democracies, and you would be correct about that. According to Foreign Policy, we've got 55% of the national elections occurring in full or flawed democracies, 30% in authoritarian. So I'm going to start with that.
I don't think the Russian election is going to be a nail biter. I don't think
I mean,
Putin's not going to be holed up with his staff on election night, a bowl of popcorn and some stolichnaya or whichever Russian standard, glued to the TV, wondering, am I going to pull it off? I think it's more going to be do I get 99.8% of the vote or 99.7%? And that's going to be the real drama in that evening. But many of those elections will be, interesting to watch. Even India, which I think we're going to try to have a soon episode on India and its emergence as a China of the 2020s, for lack of a better parallel. I don't think anyone doubts that Modi is almost certain to win, but in what way the BJP will win and in what composition and how much they'll win state by state, and like all that is an open question and will be an open question until election night. And look, my cursory read of how people are looking at the year shaping up of those 83 elections or 78 countries is more already the panoply of trepidation that surrounds these, that there's a degree of, oh my God, this is going to lead to the year of geopolitical instability. That seems to be a theme right now, late December into January, for those who like articulating a theme. Every year needs a theme, apparently. It's sort of like the Fashion Institute annual Met Gala. We need a theme this year. This year the theme is everyone's dressing in geopolitical instability.
Yes, it's not teal or turquoise or lavender, but it's geopolitical volatility.
Yes. What are you wearing? What's the latest fashion? And it's true. Elections in contested places with lots of divisions and partisan divides are question marks that raise the possibility of bad things happening. And clearly the United States is going to be ground zero for those questions, no matter what side of the political aisle you are on. And it is true demographically that most people listening to this podcast probably do not fall into the I want Trump to be president camp. But this election is going to be a challenging election in the United States. It's not going to bring out our better selves. It's not going to be, as Steven Pinker said, it's not going to remind us of the better angels of our nature. And that is true in multiple countries. But I think you pointed out in your writings, Emma, and I think we share a view that more people participating in whatever this messy thing we call democracy is a good thing net for the world, because it represents more people trying to have a say and trying to have a voice and believing that they should have a voice. The whole principle of voting is you believe that you have a say. I did a piece for the Wall Street Journal at the end of the year last year, for the literally the last issue, December 30th, and mused that there are two ways you can look at massive collective global discontent. One of which is everybody is really dissatisfied with things as they are, and the mood is darkening, and people are sour, and we live in a kind of dyspeptic dystopian time. I know I've said dyspeptic dystopian multiple times on the podcast, so for those of you who feel like you've heard that before and are getting tired of me saying it, I apologize, but it has a certain kind of nice alliterative ring to it. And the flip side is people being really discontent and going to the polls where they can and casting a vote for a person or party that they feel is going to change things. And you vote for someone because you think they're going to change things for the better, right? Every Trump voter is not voting because they think Trump is going to make the country worse. They're voting because they think he's going to make the country better. Anyone may disagree with that, just like they disagree with whoever's being voted for on the other side. But the very act of doing so can be construed as I have a voice. I think that voice should be heard. And I think the system as it is isn't working, and it should, and it can. And so there's a degree to which democracy provides an outlet for individual self-respect and collective self-determination, which is sort of the point of democracy. I think that's an incredible thing, and is a potential source of really positive change. I don't know. What do you think? Is that hopelessly optimistic?
I think even for me, it veers on, I don't want to say Pollyannish, but it definitely veers on we're ignoring some of these countries where even if they're not a full authoritarian country like Russia or North Korea. North Korea is also holding elections, by the way. Another nail biter, as you said. Even somewhere like Bangladesh or Pakistan or India, where the system's just not working exactly as it should. There's allegations of people fixing seats or not letting other parties run and things like that. We should be kind of presenting people with that reality as well. I think the optimistic view on that is that despite all these systems that are flawed, like you're saying, that people are still coming out, that they're not giving in to the cynicism. I've seen a lot of framing, not only as geopolitical instability and volatility, but that democracy is on the ballot in 2024, which I think is an enormous overstatement. I don't think that there are elections going on where people are like, yes, I would fully like to vote for an authoritarian figure because I would like a dictatorship. People who are listening to this who are virulently anti-Trump might greatly disagree with me, but I actually think that even Trump voters in the United States are not voting for Trump because they think that he's a dictator. To your point before, I think they just don't see the threats that other people see to be as great of threats, or they see threats from the other side to be as great or even greater. So I am really curious. I feel like in 2023, the big story that everybody got wrong was the United States economy and where the US is going to be as far as inflation, jobs, wages, and all of that. I'm seeing a lot of stories come out now in early 2024 about how everybody was wrong about that. I'm really curious how we're going to look at this in the January 2025 and see, did democracy survive? Because that's how it's being framed right now. And even if there are a lot of elections that don't quote unquote go the way that we want, even if we do have individual countries that might fall into hard times, I really don't think that this is going to be the deciding year where democracy just disappears.
Yeah, we had this conversation in the wake of the US midterm elections in 2022, which, as we reflected at the time, and as many people reflected at the time, were remarkably smooth. The outcome didn't please a lot of people, and no outcome of an election is likely to please a lot of people because somebody who you want to win is going to lose. Like, that's just the reality of a democratic election. But there was such agita leading up to November of 2022 in the United States, and such conviction that this was going to be some really divisive replay of 2020 leading into January 6, 2021. And none of that happened, right? Everybody accepted. There wasn't a lot of contestation of votes. There wasn't claims of vote fraud. It was a normal election that went normally in the United States. And then the Brazil election between Lula and Bolsonaro just, again, went well. It went, none of the worst fears of what was going to happen in Brazil happened. Okay, there was
except for the whole storming riot thing.
Except for the storming riot thing, everything went just fine in Brazil. No, but the fact is, the fear was more civil war, right? That the losing side wouldn't accept it, and it would actually lead to political collapse, as opposed to like a really a really bad afternoon in Brasilia. And I think the recent Argentine election, where the kind of firebrand came into power, saying that he was going to do away with half of the government bureaucracy, and as I think tried to actually do some of it, it still went smoothly as an election. Nobody contested its validity. So you're right. This year may prove to be the year of geopolitical instability triggered by billions of people going to the polls, or we may turn around in a year and recognize that lots of things happened that many people objected to in terms of outcomes, but that in many places those outcomes went democratically and smoothly. And I suppose we could get into the whole question about illiberal democracies that Fareed Zakaria has been talking about for more than 15 years, and those outcomes, as we see in Hungary and elsewhere. Maybe we're going to have more outcomes like that in Europe over the next years. We just had you're in Amsterdam now. We just saw a Dutch election that saw the ascendancy of a far-right party to probably the leadership of the next government, although in a coalition that will constrain some of that action. So there could be lots of illiberal, or things that we deem illiberal, results of a lot of these elections. But that, as you just said, is very different than democracy being on the ballot. Hungary, clearly is a negative scenario. But we thought Poland was a more negative scenario. And then the coalition led by Donald Tusk, they haven't fully formed the government they want yet, but that was a surprising outcome. People basically said, we don't want that. We don't want a permanent structural illiberal democracy a la Hungary. So,
yeah, and there are countries with potentials for positive outcomes. Taiwan is one. Mexico is another. They're having their first election between two women, which is interesting. South Africa, which has been kind of wallowing and stagnating for a while, like a shakeup could be good for them over there. And there's also Mali and Chad, which I mentioned in the newsletter. They had a coup, both had a coup around 3 years ago, currently being ruled by military juntas. They have promised presidential elections this year. Obviously, we don't know if those are going to happen. Obviously, those happen. We don't know how exactly those are going to be executed or what the outcomes are going to be. But there are also potentials for positive outcomes here, not just negative ones.
So we'll see whether or not it ends up being the year of geopolitical instability or the year of democratic efflorescence, or some combination therein.
2024 is going to be the biggest year ever for elections. Most people in the world will be living in a country that has national elections. So on the face of it, this is a great triumph for democracy, but there's a difference between quantity and quality. One of the early ones in the year is the election in Taiwan. There will be a choice between a more China-friendly candidate and a more sort of independence-leaning candidate, and that will influence relations across the Taiwan Strait, but also US-China tensions. Then there's the Indian election in the middle of the year, which is the biggest election in the world. But of course, the election everyone's going to be watching most closely is the election in the United States at the end of the year, and the question of whether Donald Trump comes back for another term.